In the 1980s, the aim of Cuban agriculture was to produce as much sugarcane as possible, which the Soviet Union bought at around 5 times market price. In exchange, the Soviet Union provided Cuba with 60% of its food imports and 90% of its petrol. This arrangement made Cuba very vulnerable. When the Soviet Union crumbled and the US tightened its trade embargo, because why wouldn't you inflict misery on an entire population just to prove a point, Cuba was headed for a crisis. In August of 1990, the Cuban government declared the special period in peacetime, implementing austerity measures aimed at ameliorating the crisis. Despite this, Cuba experienced a food crisis. It is worth reiterating that Cuba has always ranked as a food deficit country. While it is in part due to the island's colonial and neo-colonial history as a sugar producer for Spain and then the United States, respectively, it is important to bear in mind that early in the revolution, the new government elected to continue this path with the Soviet Union, thereby reproducing the dependent monocrop, mono-export economy. Both the inefficiency and the ongoing monocrop character of the agricultural sector played key roles in the devastating food crisis of the early 1990s. Statistically, the crisis was at its worst in 1993. Since food imports from the Soviet Union had stopped, the average Cuban had lost 20 pounds and 51,000 cases of optic neuropathy were counted. Optic neuropathy is a degenerative disease brought on by nutrient deficiency. Living in a survival economy, life during the special period came to resemble life under war conditions, as access to food, medicine, transportation, and even electricity became uncertain. By 1994, agricultural production had fallen to 55% of the levels of 1990. For lack of fuel and replacement parts, machines just stood unused in the fields, and the little that was harvested, for lack of transportation, often rotted before it reached stores. Cuban policymakers demonstrated remarkable ingenuity, carving a new path for socialist Cuba and surviving a crisis few developing countries could have endured without falling into chaos. An extensive rationing system was instituted to make sure that the scarce resources were at least distributed fairly. The Cuban crisis is unique in that respect, as usually the poor are hit worst during a crisis. But because of the rationing system and food programs for the vulnerable, the burden was shared. The crisis of the early 1990s rocked the nation and, by some accounts, came close to bringing about the downfall of the revolution. Ever pragmatic, the Cuban government took great steps to guarantee food security, protect social gains, and restructure both state and society. While the state of Cuban food security over the last decade and a half was not without severe problems, the government's dedication to guaranteeing human rights to food is both unique and impressive, and has justifiably garnered support within the island and around the world. This focus on food security brought about a huge shift in agricultural policy. Fidel Castro declared food security the #1 national priority, and the government embarked on the so-called Third Agrarian Reform of 1993-94. Traditional preference for state-controlled agriculture was dropped, and food prices outside of the ration system were liberalized to, for one, incentivize production through material incentives and provide an alternative and competition to the black market. Because the government had previously set food prices so low, farmers had little incentive to produce to capacity. Farmers markets, so-called agropecuarios, were started so that farmers and cooperatives could sell excess produce for extra income. The agropecuarios are therefore contentious because while they do offer food to Cubans with disposable income, they also engender differential access to foodstuffs in the marketplace. Indeed, the agropecuarios have been hugely successful since their inception at increasing food access for some, though they have also contributed to a social cleavage effect. To drive down prices at the farmers' markets, the Cuban government started markets with fixed maximum prices in 1999. Broadly speaking, these measures have been proven successful. This has been possible because of the government's overwhelming determination to achieve the most equitable distribution possible. The government placed all available products under a regimen of rationing, subsidized central industries, and maintained the priority of healthcare, education, and social security. Now, the reason why I wanted to make this video It's obviously people faced with a food crisis don't sit around idle waiting for the government to fix things, but they have their own response. And in Havana, the response was all over the city, urban gardens started popping up on rooftops, patios, balconies, anywhere there was a scrap of land. Previously, these gardens had been prohibited by the government, and they were kind of seen as a sign of poverty and underdevelopment. But now, urban gardening started to become a widespread movement. Indeed, this empowered, sustainable, ecological grassroots movement is renowned amongst food security theorists the world over. Huertos populares, as these urban gardens became known, started popping up at the beginning of the crisis, but these days make a significant contribution to food security. They started as a grassroots movement, but flourished under government support. Most of those involved in urban gardening had little to no previous experience in agriculture or gardening, so the government stepped in with expertise. The Ministry of Agriculture started the Department of Urban Agriculture and restructured land use rights, granting gardeners the rights to vacant lots and unused land as long as that land remained under cultivation by the gardener. Urban gardens managed to turn unused land into fruitful gardens, and they developed along sort of three lines. The huertos populares, which were on sort of people's patios and rooftops, organoponicos, which are cooperative gardens on vacant land within the city, and in the suburban area, comparatively larger gardens, which sort of form a green belt around metropolitan Havana. Urban agriculture has contributed to increased access to organically produced produce. In part, urban agriculture is guaranteed to increase access to a variety of sectors of the population through direct participation in production and through contributions to local schools and hospitals. While the contributions to hospitals and schools are technically voluntary, it is in effect required by local government as a form of social rent in return for granting free access to land. Organoponicos employ urban gardening techniques which are designed to deal with the poor soil quality that's usually found in vacant lots within the city. Growing is done in raised beds, often cement trough, which are filled with a mixture of soil and compost that is intended to encourage intensive growth of fresh vegetables. This method is especially useful where soil is poor and can even be done on artificial surfaces, say a disused car park. Initially, because so many new urban gardeners had no experience with gardenings, groups formed on a grassroots level to share experience and resources. Later, the Department of Urban Agriculture stepped up and started to lead workshops. These days, all over Havana, there are 70 tiendas de consultorio agrícola, or seed houses, which provide gardeners with information, tools, seeds, and advice. Using intercropping, household compost, and vermiculture, garden productivity has been achieved with minimal external inputs, applying principles of organic agriculture that are low cost, readily available, and environmentally sustainable. In 1997, urban agriculture produced 160,000 tons of produce. By 1999, only 2 years later, that had risen to 800,000 tons. By 2001, 90% of fresh fruits and vegetables which were eaten in Havana were produced in Havana. The urban agriculture program increased food security and expanded ecological approaches to agriculture. Cuba switched from what is known as the classical model of agriculture, monocrop, big machines, synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, to what is known as a low-input, sustainable agriculture, making Cuba one of the largest organic agriculture experiments in the hemisphere. Cuba pioneered the use of ants for insect control, developed a huge network for composting, and returned to animal traction. In 2003, they used only 50% the fuel, less than 10% the chemical fertilizers, and 7% of the insecticides, as were used in 1989. The idea was not to implement organic agriculture. The focus was on food security, and organic agriculture was just a means to that end. This revolution was made possible by the security granted by the government through land rights, secure markets, and education and healthcare. Now, inspired by my research, I started my own little huerto popular. And because I know that a lot of people don't have a garden, don't have a balcony, I grew all of this on my windowsill. So here I'm regrowing some onions. I just pinch off the leaves and use them as kind of like spring onions. Then here I'm regrowing some mint. Back here I have some pea shoots. Here I'm regrowing some celery. Here is the aloe vera from last week. This one sits on my coffee table, and it's spinach. All of these were started, I didn't write it down, but all of them are sort of between 1 and 6 weeks. So it's a start of something. And you know, it doesn't look too bad, sort of as decoration on my coffee table. Then back here, the big one is a bean. Whoop. I haven't quite decided yet whether I'm gonna plant it out or keep it in my flat just to see what happens. But so far it's looking pretty good. Might need some water. Oh yeah, it's gonna need some water. And back here, whoop, I have a big bowl of, the big ones is reddish green. And I actually wanted to plant some parsley back here, but it sort of takes a while for it to come up. So I put in some reddish greens, so I get a sort of 2 for 1. I can pinch out the reddish greens as the parsley comes up. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel inspired to try your hand at gardening. And if you do, let me know how it goes. All right, bye.